So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to look at the Song of Solomon tonight. And that should put us ahead of the classes in the back. Maybe. We'll see. We're going to talk about different ways that we can look at it. I don't believe that they cover it in detail in the back because it is adult themed. Just like you probably don't spend a great deal of time going through Judges chapters 19, 20, and 21 with young people. This is one of the books that kind of just gets glossed over with the younger classes. So they're not going to be covering this in the back. I don't want to alarm anybody with that, at least not in detail. But we will out here. We'll cover it as in detail as we can in one evening. If you want to stay around until, I don't know, tomorrow at about 6 o'clock, we might be able to get an introduction done. So this is one of the books that doesn't ever get talked about. It keeps good company with Jude, probably the Johns, although 1 John gets talked about. 3 John kind of gets pushed to the side. But this is one of the books that doesn't get talked about very much. And some of the minor prophets fall into this category. Some of them don't get talked about very often because when you think about the prophets, you tend to think of people like Isaiah or writings like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And those are the writings that get referenced a lot in the New Testament. So those are the writings that we pay a lot of attention to in the Old Testament. The Song of Solomon gets ignored often because it doesn't fit into a Victorian sensibility. These are things, ideas, concepts that ought not to be discussed. And it doesn't fit that. So often it isn't discussed. And we have to deal with it. And we have to read it and understand it. And we have to be careful, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that we don't allow our culture to influence the way that we view it too much. It had a purpose originally. So what are some of the ways that people try and understand this book? What's a way that people try and understand the book?
I always thought it was a love story.
A love story. That is one of the common ways. Usually people will say that this was, if we're going to take the love story route, they'll say it was a poem that Solomon wrote for his first love. And people envision Solomon as talking about his first wife. Some of them even guess at the person as to who it might be. They try to name her, or at least identify her in other places in the scriptures. This idea, that one in particular, seems to be most popular among women. Whether it's right or wrong, that just seems to be the group that tends to gravitate toward that because they seem to like the more emotional appeal to it, and guys not so much. When you get into writings and opinions, and it's interesting to see how divergent the various opinions are when they start writing about the book. Regardless of whether or not you think it is a love poem that Solomon wrote to his first wife, it clearly involves the topic of love, both passionate and erotic. And so it deals with those things, whether or not it is written to a very first love in Solomon's life. It offers the idea, if you see it that way, of Solomon writing to his very first sweetheart, it offers you the idea of seeing Solomon's life in 3 stages, which is my favorite thing about that view. This would be the young Solomon, right? The impassioned Solomon with goats parading down hills. The guy needs to work on his lines, right?
Maybe
that view, what was that?
I said maybe back then.
It's very German, actually. Germans like to compare their loved ones to animals. Americans, not so much. I say to my wife all the time, I say, I love you so much, I wouldn't trade you for a house full of egg-laying hens. She thinks it's romantic. And so that's kind of the imagery that you're going to see throughout the book. It offers you, like I was saying, it offers you the ability to view Solomon's life in 3 stages. You see this here. This would be the young Solomon. Proverbs would be like a middle-aged Solomon, and Ecclesiastes would be the aged Solomon. The reason why that is the most appealing idea of this view to me is because it makes Solomon come back. Right? You have the young Solomon in the throes of ecstasy and love with this woman. Then you have kind of the middle-aged Solomon who's like, let me tell you how things go in Proverbs. And then he ignores everything he writes and wanders off after those foreign women. And then when he's old, at the end of his life, he realizes that he's been a dummy for most of his life, and he comes back in Ecclesiastes. Whether or not that's how that all plays out, I don't know. But again, that's the most appealing aspect to me, because then Solomon comes back. And that's what we should want for everybody. So that's one way. What's another way people view the book?
God to his people?
Yeah, with God and Israel, or God and his people. Israel is an appellation for God's people even today. You are the Israel of God. If you are if you're a Christian, you're the Israel of God. This view is often taken, it's not the only reason people take it, but it's often taken to kind of tone down the sexual content a little bit, because some of the passages make people uncomfortable. There are aspects of the book that contain spiritual truths that are applicable to God's relationship to the church, or we might think of our relationship to God with this view. There are often multiple layers of application in prophetic or poetic books. That's one of the trickiest things about poetry, is that it can be understood in so many ways that you kind of have to be careful when you read it that you don't develop any deep theological doctrines off of poetic literature. For example, that's one of the problems that people have with the Psalms. People go to Psalm 51, and David says, from my birth, or from my conception, literally, I was in sin. Well, what does that mean?
So like he was never clean. He's
Yeah.
so bad now that you can't imagine a time when he wasn't doing it on the basis.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine a little Solomon floating around inside his mother, the wicked sinner, right? No, that's not what he's saying, but there are people who go to that psalm to develop the doctrine of inherited depravity, but it's poetry. And so you have to be careful that we don't go to poetic passages to either develop definite teachings or to undo definite teachings. Like if God were to say somewhere, I always use purple shoelaces or shirts or something as an example, but if God were to say somewhere over in a very clear passage, like over in Ephesians, if the Apostle Paul just threw out there, oh, by the way, stop wearing purple shoelaces, God hates that. And then over in the Psalms somewhere, you have David talk about prancing the streets in purple shoelaces. Well, should you then say, clearly here in the Psalms, David is wearing shoelaces, so that can't be what Paul means over in Ephesians. Can you do that? No. No. Because there's a very clear passage that says something. It has a meaning. And then we can't go to poetic passages and undo what the very clear passages say. And so that's backwards. What you have to do is take the very clear, straightforward passages and understand the poetry in light of those. There will be a meaning about dancing through the streets in purple shoelaces. What it would be, I have no idea. But there would be a meaning there. But it is not God undoing what he says some other place. So we have to be careful. So there are allegorical parts, or metaphorical parts, or parts that we can take that do show us this relationship between God and the church. There are romantic parts. There are very sexual parts in the book. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what either one of them is about. What are some other views? I'll just give you this one so nobody has to say it. Some people view it as a manual for husbands and wives. Like one of the things that happens over in the ancient Eastern area is how-to literature was very popular, and some people view this as the Bible's how-to literature. It's very interesting that the Bible doesn't focus very much on that part of human behavior, although there are some rough guidelines. Some commentators see all sorts of colorful descriptions in the text. Some, I don't know how you get this stuff published under biblical scholarship, but some commentaries you're reading through it and they kind of make you blush. You're like, I didn't think that's what I was coming to read. But there are some terms in there. There are some expressive comments in the book. There are some very colorful things. It doesn't make it the point of the book. Some see this as an attempt of Solomon to win a woman who is already in love with somebody else. That's actually what I think it is. I just kind of let that cat out. How many wives did Solomon have? 1,000, right? And that's probably a rounded number. It was probably more like 1 billion, right? He had a lot. To the point where after a while, you're just keeping score, almost. Right? Do you really need more than, I don't know, pick a number, $100 million? If you had $100 million in your bank account, would you need more? Well, I wouldn't. Until I have $100 million, then maybe it doesn't feel like quite so much anymore. Right? But you reach a certain point, like somebody who has $50 billion in the bank, or you're worth $50 billion. Do you really need to get to 51? Well, what drives people to do that? The want to have the number 51. Right? When you get into that area of wealth, it's almost like a competition. Who can get more? And so that actually, I think, is kind of Solomon's view towards ladies. And that fits with what you see him doing in the historical books. He is not this great romantic man who is just so passionately in love with somebody, while at the same time being married to 999 other women. Right? That doesn't work out. Karen and I joke sometimes about how would he remember their names? How would he keep them all straight? They'd have to wear name tags. Have to. Either that, or use your power as king to change their names so that you just have to remember one. Name them all Karen. Karen, how are you? It's nice to see you. Oh, hey, Karen. You look lovely today. Karen, will you please bring that to me? That's exactly what I would do, because it's so much simpler than having to remember 1,000 different names. And how do you have any kind of relationship with 1,000 different people? You can't. And so when you're looking at this guy's life, it's a mess.
Maybe he had that one love that he never quite obtained.
It could be.
And he's trying to get those thousands of women to replace that one empty.
It could be.
I don't know.
It could be.
I'm a romantic. Not that he should replace 1,000 women with one.
Right. Regardless,
That's a lot of women.
it's a flawed approach.
Yeah.
Right? Don't recommend
She
it.
was really special.
It took 1,000 to replace her in his heart.
Exactly.
That is pretty romantic until you get to the nuts and bolts of the whole crazy situation. Solomon could have had any woman he wanted in the territory control. If he shows up and says, "This is my wife now," you don't argue with the king. And God warned Israel that would happen. What did he tell them the kings would do?
Take their sons and daughters and their cattle.
He's going to take
their
their stuff.
war.
Yeah. It's going to be bad. He's going to take the best things for himself. He's going to draft your sons into his army. He's going to take your daughters for his wives. He's going to take your daughters just to work in his palace. He's just going to take. And he's going to do it and do it and do it and do it and do it. But one of the ways that Solomon's life became so splendid is by taking a lot of things. Right? He was incredibly wealthy, incredibly wise, and he took a lot of stuff. This idea also, I think, changes the message of one about passionate love between a man and a woman, which I really don't need the Bible to instruct me about. I don't need the Bible to teach me, oh, by the way, this is what passion looks like. The idea that it's some kind of a manual or a how-to book, I didn't need that either. That just works itself out. But what if that's what this is? And I'll tell you what made me start thinking about it in a minute. What if that is Solomon trying to get this woman away from the man that she really loved? And he's pulling out all the poetry. He's pulling out all the stops. He's doing everything. He's talking about how wealthy he is. Come look what you could have. To seduce this woman away from her beloved. Part of the problem is that in this dramatic presentation, it's what it is. It's kind of like a play. It's not a play. It's kind of like a play. What do they do at the very beginning of plays? What do they tell you about? It's really important information. Sometimes there's background, especially like in a historical play. Like if you go to ever watch any of Shakespeare's Richard plays or The Kings, they tell you about a little bit of the history so you know what's going on. What else do they have at the very beginning of every playbill? The characters. The characters. We don't get that. We don't get the characters. We don't get, if you're reading through it and you have all these little, breaks, she, he, chorus, he, she, others, this, that, it's not there. It's not in the text. That's not part of the breaks. And so when you read through it, in the English Standard Version, it has all these things, and it kind of breaks it up for you, and it guides you into arriving at a certain conclusion. But when you take all of those out and you're just reading through the text, and you don't have somebody else tell you where the breaks are, it can be a little difficult to figure out who all the characters are, who all the people are. There's clearly some kind of chorus, well, I think clearly, because it switches between we, and the woman will be talking to the daughters of Jerusalem sometimes. There's clearly some king. She talks about the king, that's Solomon, I think. And then there's this beloved. The beloved and the king aren't necessarily the same person. They could be, but not necessarily. And it was the very first time I asked the question, what if the king isn't the beloved, that I began to start seeing things a little bit differently. And what I think you see in this book, which I do need, is I need to be told how to remain faithful to the one that I love and the one that loves me when I'm in the lion's den, when I'm being thrown into the furnace, when I'm being tempted with worldly wealth, when I feel like I'm being drawn away and enticed. And so then the picture would be, and I think these are real events that happen in here, the picture would be of this faithful woman waiting for her shepherd to return to her and take her away from the king who is trying to steal her heart. Who is the ruler of this world? Satan. God ultimately, ultimately you've got the right answer, right? Yeah. And it's kind of a trick question. What do you mean? Right? But Satan is in charge of all the kingdoms. Satan is in charge. He's got a lot of power. There's our king trying to steal away the woman's heart. That's you. And you are longing for the return of your shepherd from over the mountain. We're waiting for Jesus to come back. We're being tempted by this world to give our heart to it and to leave the one that we love. And so are there some sexual overtones to the book? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Solomon, definitely, if that's right, is definitely trying to do that. It's also interesting that would make Solomon not the hero of the book. It would make him kind of the quasi-bad guy. And at the end, he tries to figure out why didn't it work. And so it's almost like, if this is correct, like the book is a study, like, how come I couldn't make her love me instead of this other one? How come I couldn't make her leave that other one and come to me? And so when I ask this question, how can I be faithful in a world that is so full of temptation? How can I stay faithful in a world that is so full of all these things that lure us and draw us away from God? That's the same question. And here, you're shown what this woman does. How does she remain faithful to this shepherd? Okay, so we don't have time to evaluate everything. I would caution you that I don't necessarily think, if you think one of the other common views, those are the four most common views. Well, three common views. I don't know how common the one that I like is. I would caution you that no matter what you think the book is about, that Americans have a tendency to search for the most erotic expressions or the most erotic explanations possible. I've read through some commentaries about this, and I just have to kind of close the book and put it away. And I don't think that's what it's about. I was in a classroom one time, and there was the teacher got a kick out of talking about some of the pictures in the book, and his mind went places with these pictures that mine did not. And so you kind of have to beware. I don't know if it is particular to our culture, that tendency to find the worst explanation possible. We won't call it the worst, the most erotic explanation possible. I think that may be a greater commentary on our culture than this literature itself. So we do have to be careful. Again, we also struggle with the poetic nature of things. When we're reading through the law is written in such a way that it's kind of difficult to misunderstand the law. These poetic books are written in such a way that it's very easy to misunderstand them. There are some general truths that you can draw out of the book, no matter which of those four ways you think is being discussed. And it's on those things, really, that we need to know. Ancient poems and plays, just kind of to give you some information about the structure of the book. Ancient plays often only had 2 or 3 characters. Like when you go to the ancient Greek plays, it would be very uncommon for an ancient Greek play to have 15 or 20 main characters. They tended to have 2 or 3. And they had a chorus that would sing. And you kind of see the same structure here. When you're reading through it, even the English Standard Version with its little subtitles, I think it gives you 2 characters. It gives you he and she in the chorus. That's fitting with ancient styles of poetry that we know about. And this is ancient poetry. It's an ancient, dramatic description of things. And so we kind of have to try and understand it in that way. Again, be very careful that you don't pin major theological things on this book. When God wants to speak plainly, he does. And I would also caution you to consider that you're beginning in the middle of something. Regardless of which view you take, you're beginning in the middle. Yes?
Talking about ancient Greek drama, it was often the chorus's job to deliver the moral or the message or whatever lesson you were supposed to learn. It was the chorus who did that. And that's used as an interesting thing to take into account with this. Look at what the chorus says to get your message from that, what the purpose of the book is.
Yeah. And so you kind of have to take all these things into consideration. And when you start looking at how, in our culture in particular, it deals with a topic that people don't like to talk about in public. And it deals with a topic that people don't like to talk about in mixed company. And it deals with ancient poetry, or ancient dramatic literature, we can put it like that. That's probably why we don't talk about it a lot, is because it's hard. It is very, very difficult to study. But it's in the Bible, and we should study it. And again, tonight we're getting an introduction to the book as a whole. We nowhere near have enough time to go through and even come close to scratching what it's talking about. So what we'll do is we'll just start in chapter 1. We'll read a little bit, look at it, and see if we can try and figure out how to start understanding it. And if we can begin doing that a little bit, then you can take the book home and you can get together with friends and family and read it during supper. And you can start going through it and seeing what you think it's about and what lessons you can get from it. And if you have questions about it, then we can definitely get together and talk about it. It'll be interesting.
Well, what my kids ask me.
All right, so let's start off. First one, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Who wrote it?
Solomon.
All right, that's like the concrete thing. All right, we're done. Any questions? Okay, verse 2. So here mine breaks off, or mine has a subtitle, and it says sheep. I think they're right. There's definitely a woman talking here. And this, I think, is going to be the main woman speaking throughout the rest of the song. And remember, that this is Solomon's song. Right? The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So even though you have this woman speaking, and again, I think that these kind of depict actual events in very dramatic language, very poetic, very, very image, picturesque, or pictorial language, events that I think actually happened. But this is Solomon's view, his accounting of things that happened. So even though you have this woman talking now, it's Solomon doing the singing, ultimately the presenting.
I have the New King James. It says the Shulamite instead of she. So for the header, I mean, is that the same thing? Or?
Yeah, it's just the designation they've chosen for this woman. There are some people who think that sometimes she's Shulamite, sometimes she's Shunammite. They're trying to guess at who the woman is. Some people think, if you remember back when David is old and he's cold, they bring that Shunammite woman to David. She's supposed to be very beautiful, and she warms him up. A lot of people think that maybe that is the woman. I don't know how you would figure that out. So what does she start off talking about?
Kissing.
Yeah, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Who is the him? Yes? Yeah. That's the difficulty. If she doesn't start off and saying, let him, Ralph, Mazurkowitz, at this address, let him kiss me with the kisses of, she doesn't say. And so immediately you're going to begin drawing conclusions, or you're going to begin thinking about things that are going to affect the pathway of the book. And so it's best at this point if you just kind of leave it unnamed. It's definitely a guy. She definitely wants him to kiss her, but we have no idea who either one of them are. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. For your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your frame is oil poured out. Therefore, virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. There's a break that you don't see in English that happens in verse 4. There's this adulation, this isn't everything wonderful? And then the king brings her into the chambers. And so it's not necessarily the king that she wants to smooch. It's not necessarily the king that she has this love for that is better than wine. It could be. It could be. But there's a pretty jarring break there. She's free with this man, let us run. And then throughout the time that she's with the king, she's constrained. She's stuck. We might use an English word. When she dreams about her beloved, she wants to be out in the fields. She sees him coming over mountains. There's always wilderness images when she's thinking of the beloved. And with the king, it's always in a bedroom. And so they're not the same thing. It could be, but the pictures are different. When we talk about the king, we get the palace, we get the perfume, we get the jewelry. And when you talk about the beloved, there's some of those images, but they're a lot more pastoral, bucolic, country bumpkinish in their presentation. So draw me after you, let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. Whoever she's in love with, she loves him a lot. It could be the king. It could be somebody else. If the king is not the one she loves, then the king's affections are trying to replace, and they conflict with her previous desires. So then you get the others. Who are they? If Solomon's the king, we're doing some guessing. It doesn't say. That's why it would be really nice to have a playbill. But we don't get it. So we're just told others. This says others. Yours may say chorus. Yours may not say anything.
It says the daughters of Jerusalem.
Well, that's kind of accurate, because the woman will call these others the daughters of Jerusalem. So the others could be all the daughters of Jerusalem, right? It could be like these people who represent all of the women in Israel, or the women in Jerusalem, and they are talking. It could be Solomon's wives. There's there's at least 999 other ones, right? So that might be who the others are. It could be, some people have suggested this girl's family. I don't see that. That doesn't make sense to me, but there are some people who suggest the girl's family. So really the others, I think probably the best one, the best phrase that you can get from the Bible is the daughters of Jerusalem, whatever that means. Because she will identify them as such. Now whether it's the ladies in Jerusalem, whether it's Solomon's wives, I have no idea.
I probably should know this, but it talks about in my notes before the chapter begins, talks about his 699 other wives and 300 concubines. What's the difference in the wife and the concubine? I mean, I know they serve the same purposes, but what is the difference really?
There's a lot of debate.
Eyes, are they really?
There's a lot of debate about the difference between a wife and a concubine. Some people have suggested that the concubine is a slave, but you find people who aren't slaves who are made concubines. Some people have suggested that like the Levite in Judges has a concubine, but no wife is with him. Some have suggested that you purchase a concubine. Some have suggested that the difference between a wife and a concubine is the ability of the children to inherit. That may be the best explanation, is that a wife's children have a right to inheritance, and the concubine is no less a wife per se, but her children have no right to inheritance. So what was that? Yeah. Yeah, they don't get the status that would go along with. So I don't know. It's not clear. That's another thing. Every once in a while, I would like for somebody to say, "Oh, by the way, this is what that means." But we don't always get that, and so you kind of have to deal with what you've got and work with what you can. Okay, so then these others say, "We will exult and rejoice in you. We will extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you." Who is they? I don't know. I don't know who the they is. Is it the chorus? I would think they'd say we. Rightly do we love you. Is it her family? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. And so your guess may be better than mine. And as you start filling in who these things are, you can continue reading and try and fill the gaps in. But the way that you define these groups of people is going to start changing the way that you view what is being said. And as long as you're sticking with the text, whether you think this is a romantic story, whether you think it's a poem that Solomon wrote for his first love, whether you think it's an allegory between God and Israel, the goal is really to draw out the truths. And so what is it, whoever the they are, that makes this woman wonderful? What did she just finish talking about? Yeah, her love, right? Her affection, her devotion to whomever that devotion is to. So let's take it. Let's go with the romance story. She's in love with Solomon. Right? She's talking about how much she loves Solomon. What is the message? She's being upheld for her what? To who? Devotion to who?
What she loves.
To her husband. Yeah. Not anything else that she does. I'm sure that she's probably an excellent pianist. I'm sure that she knits with the best of them. I'm sure that she plays golf better than any other ancient Middle Eastern woman. Right? But the thing that she is held up for as an example, this is why they love you, is her devotion to her husband. Allegorical. All right, so the woman would be who? The faithful people, right? The faithful people of God. Who are they in love with? God. What is it that they are extolled for?
for God.
Their love for God. That's what makes everybody love them, right? That's what's wonderful about them is their love for God, their devotion to God. So you see how you can start going through and you can, regardless of how you specifically what you think it's about. I think once you get into the more carnal things, like if people who think it's a manual, yeah, it deals with human sexuality. It deals with it a lot. But if all it is a carnal book, it's kind of hard to get those elevated themes out of it. So it deals with carnal things, but it's much more than that. And so we have to be careful. And when you get into the New Testament in particular, the New Testament deals with the husband and wife relationship in, I think, the most beautiful way that it possibly could. It uses the relationship between Christ and us to talk about what that relationship ought to look like. Are there some physical things involved in that relationship? Yes, there should be. But is that the most important part of the relationship? No. Is it an important part? Yes, it is. But it's not the most important part. And so as you're going through the book, we have to be careful that we don't get drugged down into making this something less than it is. And we have to be constantly looking for what is the higher virtue, what is the thing that deals with our emotions, that deals with our attraction between men and women, that makes us better, that makes us different from animals. We're different than from animals. So then she talks again. I am very dark, but lovely. Some translations will say very dark and lovely, and that is why people try and find other places that she's from. But when you continue reading, she's going to tell you why she's dark. So she has darker complected skin. She's going to tell you why. I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem. And that's kind of where we get our title for our chorus people. She gives it to them. Like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. So apparently Solomon had dark curtains. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me, and they made me a keeper of the vineyard. But my own vineyard I have not kept. Okay, so why is she dark? She's been out in the sun. She's been out in the sun. In the 1800s, did women wear short sleeves here, in this area? No. Did they go out without a bonnet on? No. Did they wear anything that showed above their ankle? No. Why? Because servants had tans. The help was tan. Beautiful girls were very fair. Beautiful girls had the palest skin imaginable. And so they would cover themselves from head to toe. You had women going outside in the summertime with gloves on because they didn't want their hands to turn brown. And so here the difference is between you've got these daughters of Jerusalem, whoever they are, they're not dark. And you have this other girl who comes in and she is. What do we do in our society now? We pay for people to make our skin dark, right? And so it's the exact opposite. But that's kind of what's going on here. And so as you go through and you look at ancient culture and you look at the different things that are talked about, you can begin to work your way through and you can figure this book out. You can figure out the lessons that God wants you to know. Does that mean that we're all going to think it's about exactly the same thing? Well, not necessarily. But yes, at the same time. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. If it's not my fault.